lampreys and horrifying deep sea eels and things like that. But protostomes you could divide into four basic groups. The Lophophoriates didn't have any parasites in them. The Trochozoa just have a few. We can probably cover all of those this week. Okay, I am recording, confirmed. Sorry, I heard something go ding. The Trochozoa don't have very many parasites, and we can cover those pretty much this week. The Platyzoa are a big group for parasites because they include the flatworms, the Platyhelminthes, and that, of course, includes the flukes and the tapeworms, and the monogeneans and the Aspidobothrians. The other one, the Ecdysozoa, includes nematodes or roundworms and arthropods, and both of those have lots of parasitic members. And we started with the Platyzoa. They're one of these supergroups within the protostomes. Most of them are small. They may have teeth of some sort. The coelom, the body cavity, is either absent or reduced. And the Platyhelminthes is the group that includes the parasitic flukes, tapeworms, monogeneans, Aspidobothrians, parasitic turbellariae, all that stuff we've talked about for the past 2-3 weeks. An obscure group called the Gnathostomula doesn't contain any parasites. They tend to live in places like anoxic beach sand. A group called the Gastrotricha is pretty common. You could find them in pond water, but there aren't any parasites there. A group called the Cycliophora is exclusively symbiotic on the lips of North Atlantic lobsters, because somebody has to be. They were only discovered as a phylum in, I think, 1995, not that long ago, but I won't say more about them, cool as they are. Direct your attention to a group called the rotifera. The rotifers are part of a larger group called the Syndermata, and the Syndermata also includes a group called the Acanthocephala, which are Heckin parasites. They used to be considered the only exclusively parasitic phylum, although we've changed a bit of the way we classify them. But still, there are over 1,000 species in this group, the Acanthocephala. They're the second big parasitic group in the Platyzoa after the Platyhelminthes. To talk about them, I've got to talk a bit about rotifers first. So rotifers, extremely common in both marine and in fresh waters. You see them all the time when you look at pond water under a microscope. They're extremely abundant in organic rich environments, very common, for example, in sewage treatment ponds, for example, part of the ecosystem that breaks down the sewage. They're all microscopic, typically half a micron or less, although there's a few you might just be able to see. They're all aquatic, some marine, some freshwater, and there's even a few that live in wet terrestrial habitats like damp moss. Some species are... Okay, sorry, I heard something go ding. Okay, I guess somebody added and I didn't see it. Hope everything's all right. Come on, Wagner, where was I? Okay, and there's some that live in terrestrial habitats like damp moss, for example. Some of them can live in pretty dry habitats because one major group of them can dry out completely, go into suspended animation, and then reanimate when the water comes back. So a few years ago, I actually collected some moss from the Mojave Desert and brought it back to UCA. Dr. Chowinski soaked it in water, and we got rotifers out of the thing. There were rotifers that probably spent most of their lives in suspended animation, but would come out whenever things were wet. They're very important in aquatic food webs. Baby fish eat them, little crustaceans eat them, everything that can eats them, and they primarily feed on bacteria and detritus. So they're a link in those food chains. They've got cilia on a retractable organ called the corona. Nothing to do with the virus or the beer. Creates currents that pull food particles into the mouth. The beating of the cilia on the corona looks like a wheel going around, although it isn't really. That's what gave them the name rotifera. It's Latin for things that carry wheels. Food gets pulled into the mouth and processed by a pair of jaws called the trophi, embedded in a muscular structure called the mastax. The cilia that enable rotifers to feed also enables many of them to swim. Some are sessile. Others move by looping, which means they'll stick their tail down and stick the head out, and then latch on with the head and pull the tail in, a little bit like inchworms or leeches, if you've ever seen them move. And many tissues, including the epidermis, are syncytial. And there's that word again, meaning that they're made up of essentially one cell with multiple nuclei. So here's a fairly typical one of the sort you could see in just about any pond water. There's a tail down and to the right. You can't really see them, but there's a couple of cement glands that enable the tail to grab onto things and then let go. So this one is temporarily attached to a strand of algae. The head end at the lower left has the tail. The upper right has the head. And the kind of sawtooth thing that you're looking at is the corona covered with cilia. And the cilia are beating in a... Okay, sorry, I just heard a ding-a-ling again, and I'm not seeing where it's coming from. I hope nobody is trying to join and then not being able to. Right. Okay. Where was I? Yeah, the cilia on the corona are beating in a pattern called a metachronal wave, which I might have mentioned this. It's like doing the wave at a football game, or the waves of light you might see going around certain electrical signs. Nothing is truly moving. The cilia are just, beating. They're flicking up and down. But that pattern of cilia flicking up and down appears to be going around and around. Just like when people do the wave at a sporting event, nobody's really changing seats. They're, standing up and going, whoa, and sitting down. And that wave of people standing up and sitting down is what travels. That's called a metachronal wave. And that gives the illusion that rotifers have a couple of wheels spinning around their heads. There's a cuticle that makes them fairly firm in shape. It's just inside the epidermis, and since it's intracellular, they never shed it. I promise we'll get to the parasites in a bit. The old way we used to classify rotifers was in three groups: sezonids, monogonts, and bedelloids. Sezonids, males and females, are of equal size. Monogonts have a haplodiploid life cycle. They'll alternate between haploid and diploid stages, and they'll switch from an asexual stage where only females are produced to stages where males and females are produced. In fact, much of the year, they'll be producing females only through parthenogenesis. That's when a female simply produces eggs that develop on their own without the need of sperm. So they'll reproduce asexually all through the summer, and then in the fall, they'll switch over to producing males. And the males are haploid, and the males are basically a testicle that can swim. They don't even feed. All they do is find a female, impregnate her, and produce diploid sexual stage individuals that can survive over the winter. Okay, that alternation of sexual and asexual generations is something that we have seen in some parasite groups as well. And I'm sorry, I keep hearing ding-dongs like someone's trying to join, and then I can't see what's going on. So I hope nobody is having excessive difficulties. All right, whoever you are, I'm trying to pay attention to whatever the ding-dongs are. And it always takes me a minute to switch back and forth between the presentation and the Google Meet screen. Anyway, bedelloids have completely ditched sexual reproduction. They never produce males. Reproduction is always through parthenogenesis. The females just produce eggs that develop into more females. And these are the ones that can rapidly dry out and then come back to life whenever Evanescence starts singing to them. You know, bring me to, sorry. Yeah, whenever water is added, they can come back to life. This includes the ones that we recovered from some desert moss that probably didn't get wet more than a couple times a year. And yet it had rotifers in it because they had the ability to go into suspended animation. Right. So there's a couple of Seasonids. There are 3 species known. 1 we don't know anything about. 1 feeds on bacteria. 1's a blood. They only live on small marine shrimp in the genus Saison. So at the lower right, there's a Saison. And the only place there, Saison's the only place where, sorry, got that mixed up. Nabalia is the shrimp at the lower right, and Nabalia is the only place where Saison inhabits. So odd little anomaly there, not very well studied. They're not that easy to find unless you like have access to an awful lot of Saison. Right. There's a typical monogont. The corona is up at the top. You can kind of see the cilia, though they're a little bit blurry. This one happens to be one that's commercially cultured for the fish farming industry. They're fed to fish larvae. And this is a female. They reproduce by parthenogenesis in spring and summer, but in the fall, they'll start producing dwarf males, which do nothing but fertilize the female and then die. But fertilized females produce diploid eggs that overwinter and then produce the next generation of parthenogenetic females in the spring. So that's another case of switch hitting between sexual and asexual reproduction. There's a bedelloid, Phyllodyna. The corona is at the lower left. The tail is at the upper right. This is taken with what's called dark field microscopy. This one's extremely common in places like sewage treatment ponds. DNA analyses plus the 3 known cases of fossil rotifers, of which I discovered 1 way back in grad school, confirm that bedelloids have not undergone sexual reproduction for the past 80 million years, which makes me feel better about high school. I don't know about you. When rotifers turn to the dark side, it turned out you get acanthocephalids. We used to call these guys a separate phylum, but the consistent results of DNA analyses put the Acanthocephala within rotifera. The last common ancestor of all Saisonids, monogonts, and bedelloids was also an ancestor of Acanthocephalids. So acanthocephalans are basically rotifers that have gotten huge and turned to a life of crime. They're only parasitic. They have completely lost their gut, similar to tapeworms in that regard. They absorb food directly through the body wall. And instead of a corona, they have a retractable proboscis that's covered with hooks. And they use that to attach to the wall of the gut. Heavy infestations can cause gut damage, blood loss, and what they call malabsorption syndrome, which is basically a name for anything that makes it hard for you to absorb your digested food. Weakness, tiredness, diarrhea, dehydration, that constellation of symptoms. There's a few species that do parasitize domestic animals. Pigs are prone to one. There's a few that will parasitize domestic dogs and cats, but they seem to be pretty uncommon. When I've taught this class with people who were doing vet internships, they'd never heard of them. And the research I was able to do suggests that they're really not common. So those of you that want to be veterinarians, you're not likely to see this, although it could show up. It'll probably be your veterinary parasitology professor's favorite question for stumping you. So be prepared. They rarely cause really severe problems, as far as I can tell. Infestations are often asymptomatic, at least in dogs and cats. There's no normal parasite of humans, but there are cases where humans can be infected accidentally, and I'll show you that in a bit. There's more that parasitize animals of interest to hunting and fishing. So there's a number that are parasites of ducks. There are some that are parasites of fish. It's not impossible that we could find some in lab on Thursday. I didn't see any last Thursday, but that doesn't mean they're not there. There's one in particular that's been studied a bit because it's a parasite of largemouth bass. And like a lot of parasites, they alternate between arthropod hosts and vertebrate hosts and undergo a life cycle that's got some things in common with the tapeworm life cycle, although they're not that closely related. So what does this thing look like? There's your diagram. The body is, in this case, covered with little spines that help attach the gut wall. Those may or may not be present. The proboscis is at the upper right, and the proboscis is on an introvert. And I don't mean somebody who's kind of tongue-tied at parties. Introvert means turn inwards. And introvert, you have a number of animal phyla that have introverts. It's basically a part of the body that can be retracted into the body by turning inside out. It would be a little bit like if you reached into a sock from the inside and then pulled the sock inside out, retracting the tip of the sock, into the main body of the sock. Well, an introvert is kind of like that. Retractor muscles inside can pull the introvert in and turn it inside out. So those spines are on the inside when the introvert is pulled in and don't stab the critter's organs or anything. See, my wife says it sounds like a sea cucumber, and of course she's right, because sea cucumbers have introverts too. So do a lot of free-living segmented worms. Like I said, this is a word you'll find in more than one invertebrate phylum. So that's what a living acanthocephalan looks like. And here's one under the scanning electron microscope. The proboscis is out, the introvert is out. You can see the hooks are pretty big. Parasitologists look at the shape, the size, and arrangement of those proboscis hooks as a way of identifying species and defining new species. If any of you ever take a class with Ginny Adams, you can ask about this. She was doing a study of some cave fish up in Missouri, a species called the grotto sculpin, and discovered a new species of acanthocephalan, just because nobody had bothered to look in the guts of grotto sculpin before. I think that was about 10 years ago or so, but she's the only faculty member I know who's actually done any research on Acanthocephala, kind of as an outgrowth of her work on fish. Anyhow, used to be a poster of it. I think they took it down years ago, but so there. Someone else you can talk to about acanthocephalans. The proboscis can be retracted into a muscular sac called the proboscis receptacle. The proboscis is operated by a pair of retractor muscles. The retractors will pull the proboscis into the receptacle, and then the receptacle itself can contract and push the process back out by fluid pressure or hydrostatic pressure. You know, just like if you squeeze a water balloon, right, the part you squeeze gets narrow, but the water is pushed into another part of the balloon, and that other part swells up and gets bigger. It's kind of like this. If you squeeze that proboscis receptacle, which is full of fluid, the proboscis to get shot out. And then if the proboscis receptacle muscles relax, the retractor muscles can pull the proboscis in. Anyhow, there's no gut, you'll notice. Much of the inside is gonads. You can see there's a pair of rather large testes in the middle. The copulatory, okay. All right, I guess this one happens to be a male. The male has some cement glands, which he secretes an organic cement, which he can actually use to glue a female shut. Mating among these guys is kind of creepy. The epidermis, again, is syncytial, like we've been talking about. And in this species, you can see these pretty clearly. If you look along the outer curve over on the left-hand side, you can see, I count 4 darker staining swellings on that body wall. Those are giant nuclei. And you can really see here that the epidermis is one big cell. You can't see any membranes separating those nuclei from each other. The number and the position of the giant nuclei helps you identify species. Within that epidermis, there is a system of fluid-filled canals called the lacunar system, probably functions to transport nutrients to the muscles. Important from our point of view because we see something very similar in rotifers, believe it or not. Okay, no gut, nutrients go right through the body wall. Sexes are separate. In that male, you can see a pair of testes, the cement glands that seal the female's genital opening after they've copulated. Ew. And an extensible penis connected to a sperm duct, which does pretty much what you would expect. The penis is surrounded by a pouch-like structure called a copulatory bursa. Bursa is Latin for a purse. So any structure that reminded somebody of a purse, like the sac-like membranes around your shoulder joint, for example, is called a bursa. Females, it's kind of weird because the ovaries break up during development and turn into these freely floating cell balls floating in the body cavity, not attached to anything else. They're called ovarian balls. The ovarian balls constantly bud off eggs, and eggs pass through a kind of sieve-like structure called the uterine bell, which is up at the top of this diagram, into the uterus, which is where fertilization takes place when acanthocephalans copulate. And it's neat. The eggs are just floating in the body cavity along with the ovarian balls. The uterine bell up at the top, you can see those parallel lines. The things the thing is kind of grooved. And between the grooves and muscular contractions, the uterine bell is apparently able to sort mature eggs and let them pass into the uterus and keep eggs that aren't mature yet out of the uterus. So kind of a neat little trick there that the uterus can sort the eggs that are free floating and only allow the ones that are ready to pass into the uterus. The eggs pass out of the acanthocephala and then pass out in feces. That's a couple of acanthocephalan eggs for you. The eggs are eaten by an arthropod, and they hatch into little hooked larvae called acanthores. Acanthor is best known as the adversary of He-Man in the Masters of the Universe. Oh, sorry. I'm thinking of Skeletor. Always get those confused. Although Acanthor does sound like it could be the name of a superhero. Yeah, I should pitch a movie to Marvel about a superhero called Acanthor. I mean, it would have a great hook. Sorry. Anyway, acanthors have hooks. Similar to tapeworm larvae, they'll dig their way through the gut wall, hang out in the body cavity, develop into larvae that develop the adult features called acanthellas. And the acanthella becomes a resting type larva called a cystacanth. And this is one that you can see very nicely. This is a little freshwater crustacean that's maybe a couple of millimeters long, called Gammarus. Very common in freshwaters. I see them every time I take a freshwater, pond sample. The common name for these, when anybody refers to them, is scuds. So that's a scud. And this particular one has a kind of orange football thing in his, or for all I know, her body cavity that's not supposed to be there. That's a cystacanth larva. And you'll notice that it's brightly pigmented. I'm not sure if a truly rigorous test has been done, but this seems to make them more conspicuous to their definitive hosts. The definitive host would probably be a duck. And for Gammarus to draw attention to itself with this brightly colored spot makes it an easier target for a duck or other predator. And it gets even better. There's another Gammarus at the right, Gammarus rosali. This one normally prefers bottom habitats. Infected Gammarus start swimming up at the surface, and that increases the odds that they'll get eaten by ducks. In fact, parasitized Gammarus will swim away from non-host predators faster than unparasitized Gammarus. The ones with the parasite will try harder to get away from anything that isn't a duck. But they are vulnerable to getting eaten by ducks, which is the definitive host of the Acanthocephalan polymorphus minutus. So there's another case of parasites engaging in mind control. Humans occasionally pick these up. The species Macrocantharynchus is normally a parasite of pigs, and another one called Moniliformis is normally a parasite of rats. In both cases, the eggs are shed in the feces, and they're eaten by arthropods, either cockroaches or beetle grubs. And they'll go through the acanthor, acanthella, and cystacanth stages in the cockroach or the grub. For a human to get infected, the human has to eat a raw cockroach or a raw beetle grub. This doesn't happen very often, and again, the cases that I've heard of this tend to be either toddlers or people who are forced to eat insects, possibly because they're starving. It's happened to people in war zones, for example, or people who are eating flour that's become contaminated with grubs or something like that. So it's not common in people, and it is pretty treatable if you have it. But there is no species for which humans are the exclusive definitive host. People just get it kind of accidentally. This is one of the ones that you can see in wild and domestic cats. That's Acanthocephala right there. You can see the proboscis and the spines on it quite nicely. Domestic dogs can get Onsicola canis. Neither one is particularly common. The life cycle doesn't seem to be fully known. What I read about it is that these eggs pass out in the feces, larvae develop in an insect, and then the larvae have to finish development inside a paratenic host. So if the insect gets eaten by a bird and then the bird gets eaten by a cat, the cat might conceivably come down with Onsicola fellis. The problem is the life cycle is not fully understood, or it wasn't last I checked. So this isn't something we know a lot about, and it's nowhere close to a common parasite. So those of you going in may not see these, or at least not very often. In Arkansas, sometimes rats, raccoons, and squirrels can get infected. Most of the ones that impact human life parasitize fish, reptiles, and birds. This one is Pseudocorynasoma constrictum. That's a close-up of that proboscis with all the hooks. That's a common parasite of ducks. The intermediate host is a freshwater crustacean called Hyalella. Don't know how many of you have seen Hyalella. They're used in environmental toxicology a lot. If you're testing the effect of some chemical on an aquatic ecosystem, you might feed it to a bunch of Hyalella and see what dosage will kill 50% of them. Neoechinirhynchus shows up in sunfish and bass. That's the one where we did not, as far as I know, nobody found this in their preserved fish last Thursday, but it is possible that we could. So this is worth keeping an eye out for. Now, about how we classify these, this is the currently accepted cladogram. We used to put those groups that we started with, the Caesonids, monogonts, and bdelloids, in the phylum Rotifera. But it is now looking like if you do that, the Rotifera are paraphyletic. The last common ancestor of all of the things that we used to call rotifers is also a common ancestor of acanthocephalids. You can't take the acanthocephalans out of, you can't separate them from the rotifera because if you do, you end up with a paraphyletic group, a group consisting of some, but not all, descendants of a common ancestor. So we've redefined rotifera as the monogonts plus the bdelloids. The Caesonids are now a weird little phylum of their own. Again, only 3 species in one particular habitat, so not very well studied. The acanthocephalans we can put in their own group, but all 3, Caesonids, rotifers, and acanthocephalans, get placed in a larger grouping called the Syndermata, right? Latin for skin together, referring to the syncytial epidermis. That syncytial epidermis is held up with an internal cytoskeleton that's called the intrasyncytial lamina. And that's something you see in acanthocephalans and rotifers and Caesonids. It's a feature that links all of these together. So there, acanthocephalans, rotifers that have turned to the dock side. Which reminds me, do you know why Star Wars did not take place in Alabama? Okay, the reason Star Wars did not take place in Alabama was they would have had to rewrite it so that Darth Vader said, "No, Luke, I am your father, and your uncle, and your cousin, and your nephew." Right. Okay. All right. Thank you for the thank you. I'm imagining you all laughing uproariously, and I just better stop recording. So